Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Laura Perls, the architect of embodied presence and authentic meeting. Together and apart, they mapped different territories of psychological healing, one through the vast landscapes of symbol and archetype, the other through the intimate ground of breath, body, and living contact. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the journey toward wholeness. One seeing the psyche as a realm of images demanding integration, the other discovering healing in the immediacy of felt experience and genuine encounter. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Laura Perls as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the early decades of the 20th century, as the old certainties of European civilization crumbled into the mechanized horror of World War, two very different responses to human suffering began to take shape. One emerged from the consulting rooms of Zurich, where Carl Gustav Jung was withdrawing from the psychoanalytic movement he had helped to build, descending into what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. The other would eventually crystallize in the unlikely crucible of post-war America, carried there by a German Jewish woman who had fled the Nazi terror with her husband, bringing with her a radically different vision of psychological healing, one rooted not in the depths of archaic imagery, but in the living, breathing surface of present experience. Laura Posner was born in Pforzheim, Germany, in 1895, into a world that would soon be shattered beyond recognition. She came of age in the turbulent years of the Weimar Republic, a time when German intellectual life blazed with unprecedented creativity, even as political chaos gathered on the horizon. While Jung, 20 years her senior, was already established in his practice and his break with Freud, Laura was still forming her understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to be present, what it meant to encounter another person authentically. Her early education was in law, a path that might seem distant from the psychological terrain she would eventually inhabit. But even in her legal studies, there was a concern with justice, with seeing clearly, with a tension between abstract principle and lived reality. She studied in Frankfurt, where the intellectual atmosphere was charged with phenomenological philosophy, with attempts to return to the things themselves, to strip away theoretical overlay and encounter experience directly. It was during these years that Laura discovered the movement that would fundamentally shape her understanding: expressionist dance, particularly the work of Elsa Gindler. Here was a radical proposition that the body itself was intelligent, that awareness could be cultivated through attention to breath and movement, that psychological transformation happened not through interpretation but through presence. Gindler taught what she called Arbeit am Menschen, work on the human being, a practice of bringing consciousness to the smallest movements, the quietest sensations. For Laura, this was revelation, The body was not, as so much of Western thought had insisted, merely a vessel for the mind, a crude container for the soul. The body was where experience happened, where truth lived, where falseness revealed itself through tension and constriction. Years later, she would say that you could see someone's entire psychological structure in how they breathed, how they held their shoulders, how they met your gaze or looked away. Meanwhile, in Zurich, Jung was having a very different revelation. In the years following his break with Freud, roughly 1913 to 1919, he had plunged into an extended psychological crisis. He recorded this descent in what would eventually be published as the Red Book, a massive illuminated manuscript documenting his encounters with figures from what he called the collective unconscious. Jung's method during this period was active imagination deliberately entering a state between waking and dreaming, allowing images to arise spontaneously, engaging them as though they were real beings with their own agendas and wisdom. For Jung, the psyche was fundamentally imaginal. It spoke in pictures, in myths, in symbols that had roots deeper than personal history. When a patient came to him with a symptom or a dream, Jung looked for the archetypal pattern beneath it, the hero's journey, the encounter with the shadow, the sacred marriage of opposites. He believed that these patterns were universal, that beneath the surface differences of culture and era, human beings shared a common psychological substrate, a collective unconscious populated by archetypes that shaped our experience from within. This was a vision of extraordinary grandeur. Jung saw the human psyche as continuous with something vast and ancient, stretching back through millennia of human experience, perhaps even deeper into biological evolution. The symbols that appeared in dreams and fantasies were not merely personal but transpersonal, linking the individual to the eternal. To work with the unconscious meant to enter into dialogue with these archetypal forces, to learn their language, to integrate their wisdom. Laura's path led her, by contrast, increasingly toward the particular and the immediate. She married Frederick Perls, called Fritz, in 1930, and together they began to develop what would become Gestalt therapy. But it's crucial to understand that while Fritz would later become the more famous figure, the loud and charismatic performer of therapeutic demonstrations, Laura was, in many ways, the deeper thinker, the one who maintained connection to the phenomenological roots of their work. The couple fled Germany in 1933 as the Nazi regime consolidated its power. They went first to Holland, then to South Africa, finally to the United States in 1946. This experience of displacement, of being uprooted from familiar ground, perhaps deepened Laura's commitment to presence, to finding one's ground in immediate experience rather than in abstract frameworks or cultural traditions. When your world can be torn away, when the familiar markers of identity become dangerous rather than sustaining, where do you find stability? Laura's answer was, in the body, in the breath, in the capacity to be present to what is actually happening right now. The name they eventually chose for their approach, Gestalt therapy, pointed to something essential. Gestalt is a German word without a perfect English equivalent, meaning roughly whole form or organized pattern. It comes from Gestalt psychology, which had demonstrated that perception operates holistically. We see wholes before we see parts, and the whole is always more than the sum of its elements. A melody is not just a sequence of notes. It's a form that remains recognizable even when transposed to a different key. Laura and Fritz extended this insight into therapy. The person sitting before you is a whole organism, they insisted, not a collection of separate faculties or a psyche divided from a body. When someone speaks, they are not just producing words, they are breathing in a certain way, holding their body in a certain posture, making or avoiding contact with their eyes. All of this is communication. All of this is psychology. More radically, Laura insisted that the therapeutic relationship itself was a gestalt, a whole field. You could not understand the client in isolation, as though they were an object to be analyzed. You had to understand the living encounter between client and therapist, the field of awareness that arose between them. What happened in that between space was the therapeutic action. Now, one might wonder how Jung, with his focus on archetypes and the collective unconscious, would have received such ideas. There's no evidence that Jung and Laura Perls ever met, though they were certainly aware of each other's work by the 1950s. They inhabited different worlds, Jung in his tower at Bollingen, still plumbing the depths of alchemical symbolism and Eastern philosophy. Laura in New York, working with clients in her apartment office, teaching workshops that emphasized awareness, exercises, and present-centered experience. But imagine, if you will, a meeting that never happened. Imagine Jung in his consulting room in Küsnacht, with its view of the lake, surrounded by books and artifacts from his travels, African masks, Pueblo pottery, Sanskrit texts. And imagine Laura arriving for a conversation, bringing with her that quality of alert, grounded presence that her students always remarked upon. What would they have discussed? Perhaps they would have begun with dreams, since both worked extensively with dreams, though in strikingly different ways. For Jung, a dream was a message from the unconscious, using the ancient language of symbols to compensate for one-sidedness in consciousness. When a rational, intellectual man dreamed of dark forests and mysterious women, Jung saw the psyche attempting to restore balance, bringing forward the neglected feminine, the instinctual, the earthy. He would amplify the dream images, exploring their mythological parallels, their alchemical resonances, their connection to archetypal patterns. If a patient dreamed of a snake, Jung might discuss the snake in Gnosticism, in Kundalini Yoga, in fairy tales, gradually building up a sense of the snake's symbolic weight. The snake is transformation, healing, danger, wisdom, the earth-bound opponent of the soaring spirit. Through this amplification, the dreamer could begin to grasp what the unconscious was trying to communicate. Laura's approach was utterly different. When a client brought a dream to her, she was less interested in what it might mean symbolically and more interested in what the client experienced in telling it. How do you feel right now? As, would you describe that snake? Or do you feel it in your body? Show me with your hands what the snake's movement was like. Can you become the snake? Speak as the snake? This method, which Fritz made famous, but which Laura practiced with more subtlety, was called working in the here and now. The point was not to interpret the dream from outside, but to have the client re-experience it, embody it, make it present. Often, Laura found, the act of embodying different elements of the dream, becoming both the snake and the person afraid of the snake, led to immediate insights that bypassed interpretation entirely. The client might discover, through embodying the snake, that it represented their own suppressed anger, or their sensuality, or their wisdom. But this discovery didn't come through intellectual analysis. It came through the direct experience of speaking as the snake, moving like the snake, feeling the snake energy in their own body. The interpretation arose from the organism's own awareness, not from the therapist's knowledge of symbols. Jung, we can imagine, would have found this interesting but ultimately limited. Yes, the immediate experience matters, he might say. But the dream snake carries meanings that stretch far beyond personal experience. It connects to the archetypal image of the serpent, which has appeared in human consciousness for tens of thousands of years in every culture, always marking a threshold between different states of being. To focus only on what the client experiences in the moment is to cut off access to this depth, to treat the psyche as though it were only personal, when in fact it is rooted in the collective. Laura, in turn, would have questioned Jung's metaphysics. Who says there is a collective unconscious populated by archetypes? Perhaps what Jung calls archetypes are simply common human experiences given shape by cultural conditioning. The snake appears in many traditions, yes, but perhaps this is because humans everywhere have encountered snakes, have recognized them as dangerous and fascinating, have woven them into stories. You don't need to posit a transpersonal psychic realm to explain this. More fundamentally, Laura might say, your method of amplification. Carl, this process of layering mythological associations onto the dream image, doesn't this risk taking the client away from their direct experience? When you tell someone about the snake in Gnosticism and Kundalini, you're giving them concepts, theories, interpretations. You're putting something between them and their actual experience. The point is not to understand the dream intellectually, but to live it, to discover what it has to show through embodied awareness. We are touching here on a profound divide, one that runs through all of psychology, perhaps through all of human thought. It is the divide between depth and surface, between the hidden and the revealed, between interpretation and direct experience. The project was built on the premise that the most important psychological realities are not visible on the surface. They are buried, unconscious, disguised. They speak in symbols precisely because they cannot speak directly. The task of analysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to translate the symbolic language into something the ego can grasp and integrate. Laura's entire project, by contrast, was built on the premise that everything essential is already present, if only we could learn to see it, to feel it, to be with it. The problem is not that important material is hidden in the unconscious. The problem is that we are not present to what is already here. We are lost in thoughts about the past and future, in abstractions and interpretations, in self-concepts that obscure our actual experience. Healing comes not through digging deeper, but through coming more fully into contact with what is. As you lie here, drifting towards sleep, you might notice that both approaches have a certain appeal, a certain truth. There are times when depth psychology speaks to your experience, those moments when you feel driven by forces you don't understand, when your dreams seem to carry messages from somewhere beyond your conscious control, when the old myths and stories illuminate your life with uncanny precision. At such times, Jung's language of archetypes and the collective unconscious feels profoundly true. But there are other times when phenomenology speaks more directly, those moments when you realize you've been lost in your head, disconnected from your body, when you suddenly notice your shallow breathing or tight shoulders, when you discover that what you thought was a complex psychological problem resolves simply by being present to what you actually feel. At such times, Laura's emphasis on awareness and embodiment feels like liberation from unnecessary complication. The question is whether these two approaches are ultimately compatible or whether they rest on incompatible assumptions about the nature of mind, self, and reality. Let us delve deeper into their histories before we attempt to answer this question. For both Jung and Laura Perls, the paths that led them to their distinctive approaches were winding and complex, shaped by personal crisis, intellectual ferment, and the catastrophic events of the 20th century. Jung was born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, the son of a Protestant pastor. His childhood was marked by solitude and intense inner experiences. He was aware from an early age of what he called his number one and number two personalities, the ordinary schoolboy and the older, wiser figure who seemed to carry ancient knowledge. This early sense of multiplicity within the self would profoundly shape his later understanding of the psyche as composed of many semi-autonomous complexes and figures. His medical training in Basel and his early psychiatric work at the Berg-Holzli Hospital in Zurich introduced him to the empirical study of the mind. Under Eugen Bleuler, Jung conducted word association experiments, discovering that certain words produced delayed responses or unusual reactions, indicating what he called complexes emotionally charged networks of associations operating largely unconsciously. This work caught the attention of Sigmund Freud, and from 1906 to 1913, Jung was Freud's chosen heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. But Jung could never quite accept Freud's insistence that sexuality was the primary driver of psychological development. For Jung, the psyche was oriented not just toward the past, toward the resolution of childhood conflicts, but also toward the future, toward what he would call individuation, the process of becoming fully oneself. Moreover, Jung's experiences convinced him that the unconscious was not merely personal, not just a repository of repressed memories and wishes, but also transpersonal, collective, the accumulated psychic inheritance of humanity. The break with Freud, when it came, was devastating. Jung lost not just a mentor, but his position in the psychoanalytic movement, many of his friends and colleagues, his sense of intellectual home. He entered the period of psychological crisis that lasted roughly from 1913 to 1919, during which he deliberately cultivated fantasies and engaged with unconscious figures, recording these encounters in the Red Book. What emerged from this crisis was Jung's distinctive approach. He had discovered, or believed he had discovered, that the unconscious was not just chaos or repressed material, but had a structure, populated by recurring figures and patterns, the anima and animus, the shadow, the wise old man, the great mother. These archetypes, as he came to call them, seemed to have a life of their own. They appeared spontaneously in dreams and active imagination, behaving like independent personalities, with their own perspectives and agendas. Moreover, Jung found that these figures appeared not just in his own psyche, but in the dreams and fantasies of his patients, and in the myths and religions of cultures around the world. The hero's journey, the death and rebirth motif, the search for the lost treasure, the confrontation with the dragon, these narrative patterns repeated endlessly across human cultures. For Jung, this could only mean that something was operating beneath cultural differences, some common ground of human psychology. By the 1920s and 30s, when Laura was coming into her own as a thinker, Jung's system was fully elaborated. He had written extensively on psychological types, on the archetypes, on the process of individuation. He was studying alchemy as a symbolic system paralleling psychological development. He was exploring Eastern philosophy, particularly the I Ching and Tantric Buddhism. His vision was grand, syncretic, embracing everything, from fairy tales to quantum physics in an attempt to understand the psyche's depths. Laura's formation was very different. She grew up in a middle-class Jewish family in pre-war Germany, part of that remarkable generation of German Jewish intellectuals who contributed so disproportionately to 20th century thought before being scattered or destroyed by Nazism. The intellectual atmosphere of Weimar Germany was intoxicating experimental theater, psychoanalysis, phenomenological philosophy, revolutionary politics, expressionist art. Everything seemed possible. Everything was being questioned. When Laura encountered the work of Elsa Gindler in the 1920s, it fit naturally into this atmosphere of experimentation. Gindler was teaching people to pay attention to breathing, to notice how they moved, to discover the ways that psychological patterns were embodied in physical habits. This was not gymnastics or mere exercise. It was a practice of awareness, a way of becoming, conscious of the unconscious, not Jung's unconscious of archetypes and symbols, but the body's unconscious of ingrained tensions and forgotten capacities. Laura studied psychology in Frankfurt with Goldstein and Gelb, Gestalt psychologists who were investigating how brain injuries affected perception and behavior. From them, she absorbed the idea that organisms operate as wholes, that you cannot understand a function by isolating it, but must see how it fits into the total pattern of behavior. She also absorbed the phenomenological method, the attempt to describe experience exactly as it appears, without importing theoretical assumptions. Her work with Gestalt psychology, phenomenology, and body awareness practices gave Laura a distinctive lens through which to view human psychology. The person before you is not a mind inhabiting a body, nor a psyche containing an unconscious realm of archetypes. The person is an organism in environment, a whole pattern of functioning, always in relationship with their surroundings. Health means maintaining good contact with the environment, being able to respond flexibly to changing situations. Neurosis means rigid patterns, fixed ways of responding that may have been adaptive once, but are no longer appropriate. When Laura met Fritz Perls, he brought his own background in psychoanalysis, having been analyzed by Wilhelm Reich, who was pioneering the idea that character structure was armored in the musculature, that neurosis was literally embodied in how people held their bodies. Reich's vegetotherapy, which involved touching and working directly with muscular tensions, was controversial within psychoanalysis, but it profoundly influenced the emerging Gestalt approach. Fritz and Laura synthesized these various streams, Gestalt psychology, phenomenology, existentialism, Reich's body work, elements of psychoanalysis into something genuinely new. But it was Laura, more than Fritz, who kept the approach grounded in careful phenomenological observation and embodied awareness. Fritz was brilliant but impulsive, given to oversimplification and showmanship. Laura was more rigorous, more interested in the philosophical foundations, more attentive to the subtleties of contact and presence. Their time in South Africa, from 1934 to 1946, was a kind of incubation period. They established a psychoanalytic institute, trained students, raised a family, but they were also refining their ideas, moving away from classical psychoanalysis towards something more experiential and present-centered. The book, Fritz, published in 1947, Ego, Hunger and Aggression, signaled the break with Freudian orthodoxy, though it would be years before Gestalt therapy was fully articulated. The move to America after the war brought them into contact with a new intellectual scene. New York in the late 1940s and 50s was crackling with energy, abstract expressionism, bebop, existentialism, the human potential movement beginning to stir. Laura established herself as a therapist and teacher in New York, working quietly but influencing many. Fritz, more restless, eventually moved to California, where he became famous for his theatrical workshop demonstrations. It's important to emphasize this. Laura Perls never became famous in the way Fritz did, or in the way Jung did. She published relatively little. Her influence was largely through her practice and teaching, through the therapists she trained, through the living example of her way of being with clients. This makes her harder to pin down than Jung, whose voluminous writings and recorded seminars give us extensive access to his thought. But those who worked with Laura speak with remarkable consistency about certain qualities: her complete presence, her ability to see through pretense without judgment, her embodiment of the principles she taught. She didn't just talk about awareness, she manifested it. Students describe how she would notice the smallest gesture, the slightest shift in breathing, and bring gentle attention to it, not interpreting it, but simply making it available for awareness. By the 1950s, when Jung was in his 70s and Laura was entering her most productive period, the two approaches stood as distinct alternatives within the psychological landscape. Jung had retreated somewhat from clinical practice, focusing more on his scholarly work, his investigations into synchronicity, and the relationship between psyche and matter. He was respected, even revered, but also somewhat marginalized within mainstream psychiatry, seen as too mystical, too willing to entertain ideas beyond the scientific pale. Laura and the emerging Gestalt therapy movement were part of a broader humanistic psychology wave that included figures like Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, and Rollo May. These thinkers rejected both Freudian psychoanalysis and behaviorism, seeking a psychology that honored human experience, freedom, and potential. Within this context, Gestalt therapy's emphasis on awareness, contact, and present-centered experience fit naturally. The cultural context of the 1950s and 60s was also shifting in ways that favored phenomenological and experiential approaches. There was growing interest in Eastern philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism, which emphasized direct experience over conceptual understanding. The counterculture questioned authority and traditional frameworks, valuing authenticity and immediate experience over received wisdom. Gestalt therapy, with its emphasis on awareness and present moment experience, resonated with these cultural currents. Jung's approach, by contrast, could seem baroque and overly intellectual to those seeking immediate transformation. The careful study of symbols, the analysis of transference and countertransference, the long process of individuation, these seemed, to critics, like elaborate detours when what was needed was direct engagement with here-and-now experience. And yet, there were also those who found Gestalt therapy superficial, a kind of encounter group emotionalism that touched the surface but missed the depths. Jung's insistence on the archetypal dimension, on the connection between individual psychology and timeless patterns, spoke to something that phenomenological approaches seem to neglect: the vertical dimension of experience, the axis connecting the personal to the transpersonal, the temporal to the eternal. These debates were not merely theoretical. They reflected real differences in how people experienced psychological work. Some found that Jungian analysis opened doors to profound dimensions of meaning, connecting their personal struggles to mythological patterns in ways that felt illuminating and empowering. Dreams became doorways to wisdom. Symptoms became invitations to self-discovery. the long process of analysis, the fee 24, careful attention to unconscious material, created a container for deep transformation. Others found that Gestalt therapy cut through intellectual defenses and brought them into immediate contact with avoided feelings and disowned parts of themselves. The emphasis on awareness rather than interpretation prevented the endless circular thinking that could characterize depth approaches. The focus on embodiment grounded psychological work in felt experience rather than abstract concepts. Transformation happened not through understanding, but through full contact with what is. As you rest here, you might notice how these two approaches address different aspects of your own experience. There are times when you feel connected to something larger than yourself, when your dreams seem to carry weight and significance, when the old stories illuminate your path. At these times, you are inhabiting the territory Jung mapped, the realm where personal and transpersonal meet. But there are also times when you are simply breathing, simply present to the sensation of your body, simply aware of this moment as it is. At these times, you are touching what Laura Perls pointed toward, the ground of immediate experience that doesn't need interpretation to be meaningful. The question we are circling around is whether these are two aspects of a single reality or two incompatible metaphysics. Can we honor both the depth of symbolic meaning and the immediacy of embodied presence? Or must we choose between a psychology of hidden depths and a psychology of revealed surfaces? To explore this question more fully, we need to examine their core concepts in detail, seeing exactly how Jung and Laura Perls approached the fundamental questions of psychological life. What is consciousness? How does change happen? What is the nature of the self? What is the role of the body? How do we understand relationship? Let us begin with consciousness itself. For Jung, consciousness is only a small part of the psyche, perhaps even the smaller part. It is like an island floating in the vast ocean of the unconscious. Consciousness has a center, the ego, which provides continuity and identity. The ego experiences itself as the subject, the I to whom things happen. But the ego's perspective is necessarily limited, partial, caught in its own concerns and blind spots. Surrounding the ego, both supporting and threatening it, is the personal unconscious material that was once conscious but has been forgotten or repressed, along with perceptions and experiences that never quite made it to consciousness but left traces nonetheless. This personal unconscious contains complexes, those emotionally charged networks of associations that can seize control of consciousness, making us behave in ways our ego wouldn't choose. But beneath or beyond the personal unconscious lies the collective unconscious, a deeper stratum that is not personal at all, but inherited, universal, the psychological, equivalent of our biological instincts. This collective unconscious is structured by archetypes, innate forms or patterns that shape how we experience fundamental situations like birth and death, love and separation, the meeting with the stranger, the search for meaning. For Jung, the development of consciousness is humanity's central task and achievement. In the beginning, there was only unconsciousness, the state of participation mystique where humans were merged with nature, where there was no clear boundary between self and world, inner and outer. The development of ego consciousness, the ability to stand apart and observe, to say I, and mean something distinct from not I, was a hard-won evolutionary and historical achievement. But consciousness has its price. By distinguishing ourselves from nature, by developing the ability to reflect and choose, we have also become alienated, separated from the instinctual wholeness of unconscious unity. The symbols that arise from the unconscious are attempts to heal this split, to reconnect consciousness with its unconscious roots without losing consciousness's hard-won gains. Dreams, for Jung, are the primary avenue through which the unconscious communicates with consciousness. They arise spontaneously, without ego control, presenting images that often seem bizarre or nonsensical to the rational mind. But these images are not random. They are symbolic communications, using a language older than words, attempting to compensate for one-sidedness in consciousness, to bring forward what has been neglected, to reveal patterns and possibilities the ego hasn't recognized. The process Jung called individuation is essentially the progressive development and differentiation of consciousness through ongoing dialogue with the unconscious. It involves recognizing and integrating the shadow, those aspects of ourselves we've denied or projected onto others. It involves encountering the contrasexual other within the anima in men, the animus in women, and learning to relate to these inner figures rather than projecting them onto outer partners. It involves, ultimately, establishing a relationship with what Jung called the self, the archetype of wholeness, the inner ordering principle that transcends ego and organizes the total personality. This is a vision of consciousness as fundamentally incomplete, always in need of input from beyond itself, always partial until it establishes right relationship with the unconscious ground from which it emerges. Consciousness is not self-sufficient. It is one pole of a bipolar psyche, achieving health only when it maintains a living connection with its opposite and complement. Laura Perls' view of consciousness is radically different. For her, consciousness is not a thing or a place, but a process, an activity. Consciousness is awareness, the organism's capacity to orient itself in its environment, to know where it is and what it needs. This awareness is not limited to thought or introspection. It includes sensory awareness, proprioceptive awareness, emotional awareness. It is, fundamentally, a whole-body phenomenon. Moreover, consciousness is not opposed to the unconscious in Laura's framework. Rather, there is simply what we are aware of and what we are not currently aware of. The unconscious is not a separate realm populated by autonomous complexes and archetypes. It is simply the vast field of experience that is happening but not being attended to at this moment. When you focus on reading these words, you may not be aware of the pressure of the surface beneath you, but that pressure is there, part of your experience. It doesn't need to be interpreted or integrated. It simply needs to be noticed when it's relevant. For Laura, problems arise not from the unconscious as such, but from interruptions in the awareness process. We learn, usually in childhood, to block awareness of certain experiences, perhaps anger that wasn't allowed, or sadness that received no response, or excitement that was punished. These blocks become habitual, automatic. We develop what Gestalt therapy calls interruptions of contact. We stop breathing fully, we tighten certain muscles, we narrow our attention, we go into our heads to avoid feeling. The result is that we are not fully present to our experience. We are not aware of what we actually feel, need, or want. We operate according to fixed patterns, what Gestalt therapy calls fixed gestalts, rather than responding freshly to each new situation. We live in the past or future rather than the present. We relate to our idea of ourselves or others rather than to the actuality. Healing, in this framework, doesn't require making the unconscious conscious in Jung's sense. It requires removing blocks to awareness, restoring the capacity for full contact with present experience. This happens not through interpretation, but through experiments in awareness. The therapist might say, "Notice how you're breathing right now. What do you feel in your body as you say that? Try saying that again, and this time, stay in contact with me." These simple interventions bring attention to what is actually happening. Often, the client discovers something surprising. "Oh, I'm holding my breath. My jaw is clenched. I'm looking away from you." These discoveries are not intellectual but experiential. The person doesn't just think, "I'm holding my breath." They experience themselves holding their breath, feel the tension, notice what happens when they allow a fuller breath. This experiential awareness naturally leads to change. When you fully experience holding your breath, you also experience the impulse to breathe, the relief of letting go, the way breathing more fully affects your whole state. You don't need to understand why you hold your breath or trace it back to childhood origins. The awareness itself, sustained and deepened, is transformative. For Laura, consciousness is not a light shining into darkness, not ego heroically wresting awareness from the unconscious. Consciousness is the organism's natural state of good contact with its environment. When contact is blocked, awareness narrows, experience becomes rigid and repetitive. Therapy is not about analyzing or interpreting, but about restoring the capacity for full, vivid, present awareness. The contrast could hardly be more stark. Jung's consciousness is partial, limited, needing constant supplementation from the unconscious. Laura's consciousness is potentially whole, needing only to be freed from habitual blocks and constrictions. Jung looks down into depths. Laura looks directly at the surface. Jung seeks meaning in symbols. Laura finds meaning in direct experience. And yet, we might notice a curious convergence. Both Jung and Laura Perls believe that human beings are oriented toward wholeness, that there is something in us that seeks completion, integration, fuller being. For Jung, this organizing principle is the self, the archetype of wholeness that guides the individuation process through dreams and symptoms. For Laura, it is the organism's inherent self-regulating capacity, its natural tendency toward health when blocks to awareness are removed. Both also emphasize the importance of attending to what spontaneously arises rather than imposing predetermined theories or interpretations. Jung insisted on following where the unconscious led, rather than forcing its contents into Freudian or any other framework. Laura insisted on staying with what the client actually experiences, rather than telling them what they must be feeling or what their experience must mean. Both value direct encounter Jung with the figures of the unconscious through active imagination. Laura with other people and with one's own experience in the present moment. Both were suspicious of purely intellectual approaches that remained in the head, avoiding real engagement, and both understood that transformation often happens through attending to what seems small or insignificant, the odd detail in a dream, the slight shift in posture or breathing. But these similarities exist within fundamentally different ontologies, different understandings of what is real. For Jung, the imaginal realm of archetypes and symbols is real, perhaps more real than the surface world of ordinary consciousness. When he engaged with the figures in his active imagination, Philemon, the wise old man who seemed to have knowledge Jung didn't possess, Salome, the dangerous feminine figure, the snake he experienced. These not as products of his personal imagination, but as encounters with autonomous psychic realities. This is the aspect of Jung that many found difficult, even impossible, to accept. Was he saying these figures literally existed? In what sense? Jung was often frustratingly imprecise on this point, but he clearly believed that archetypes had a kind of existence, independent of individual consciousness. They were not merely concepts or patterns that psychologists had identified. They were real forces, real structures shaping psychological experience from within. For Laura and the phenomenological tradition she drew on, this kind of metaphysical claim was precisely what needed to be bracketed, set aside. We don't need to make claims about what exists in some transpersonal realm. We need to describe, as precisely as possible, what actually appears in experience. When a client reports a dream of a snake, we have a report of an experience, and we can work with that experience. We don't need to import theories about what the snake means in Gnosticism or Kundalini Yoga. We can stay with what the client experiences when they attend to the snake dream. This difference is not merely academic. It shapes everything about how therapy proceeds. Imagine a client comes to Jung and says, "I had a dream last night. I was in an old house, exploring the basement. I found a door I'd never noticed before. When I opened it, there were stairs going down into darkness. I could hear water dripping. I was both frightened and fascinated. I wanted to go down the stairs, but I woke up." Jung would hear in this dream a classic motif of descent, of exploring the unconscious. The old house is the personality. The basement is the personal unconscious. The hidden door and deeper stairs suggest the collective unconscious. The water is the flowing life of the unconscious, the source of renewal, but also danger. One can drown in the unconscious. The client's mixed feelings, fear and fascination show healthy respect for this undertaking. Jung might amplify the image. "Your dream reminds me of myths, of descent Orpheus, descending to the underworld to retrieve Eurydice, Inanna's descent through the 7 gates, Persephone taken down to Hades. These stories all involve encountering what has been lost or neglected, bringing it back to consciousness. What in your life is calling you downward into depths you've avoided?" He would be interested in what the client associates to the dream, but he would also bring his vast knowledge of symbols to bear, showing the client how their personal dream connects to transpersonal patterns. This has a profound effect. The client's individual experience is dignified by connection to the mythic, the archetypal. Their journey is not just personal, but an instance of the eternal human journey. Now, imagine the same client brings the same dream to Laura Perls. Laura would not amplify or interpret. She would say, "Tell me the dream again, but this time tell it in the present tense as though it's happening now." The client, "I am in an old house, exploring the basement. I find a door I've never noticed before. I open it." Laura, "How do you open it?" Client, "Carefully, slowly." Laura, "Show me with your hands." The client makes the gesture of slowly opening a door, and as they do, something happens in their body. Perhaps they notice they're holding their breath. Perhaps their heart beats faster. Perhaps they feel a tightness in their chest. Laura, what do you experience right now? Making that gesture. Client, "I feel afraid, excited, like I'm doing something forbidden." Laura. Stay with that feeling. Where do you feel it in your body? The work proceeds not through understanding what the dream means, but through re-experiencing it, bringing it into the present, embodying it. Laura might also have the client become different elements of the dream. Be the door. What do you experience as the door? Be the darkness. Speak as the darkness. These techniques can produce powerful insights, but they are insights of a different kind than Jung's amplifications. The client might discover, through becoming the darkness, that the darkness is not threatening but peaceful, that it's been waiting to be entered. Or they might discover that they themselves are the door, that they've been keeping something locked away. These discoveries arise from direct experience rather than from mythological knowledge. Which approach is more effective? This is almost impossible to answer definitively, because effectiveness depends partly on what one is trying to accomplish and partly on the client's style and needs. For some people, Jung's approach of connecting personal experience to larger patterns is deeply healing. It provides context, meaning a sense of participation in something greater than oneself. The long process of Jungian analysis can be profoundly transformative, gradually shifting one's entire orientation toward the psyche and toward life. For others, Gestalt therapy's immediacy is what works. The focus on present experience cuts through intellectualization and brings direct contact with avoided feelings and needs. Change can happen quickly when blocks to awareness are removed, when the organism's natural self-regulating capacity is restored. People report feeling more alive, more authentic, more capable of real contact with others. Some have suggested that Jung's approach works better for certain kinds of problems or certain stages of life. When someone is facing a crisis of meaning, when their life structure has collapsed or seems hollow, when they are drawn to questions about purpose and transcendence at such times, Jung's attention to the archetypal and symbolic dimension may be precisely what is needed. The psyche is asking big questions, and mythological amplification addresses these questions at their own level. Laura's approach might be especially powerful for those suffering from over-intellectualization, from disconnection from body and feeling, from inability to be present. It might work better in the early stages of therapy when someone needs to establish basic contact with their own experience. It might also be more appropriate for certain kinds of trauma work, where interpretation could be re-traumatizing but gentle attention to present sensation can help integrate frozen experience. But these are generalizations, and individual cases always defy generalization. What seems clear is that Jung and Laura Perls identified different dimensions of healing and developed different technologies for working with those dimensions. Jung developed techniques for working with the imaginal, amplification, active imagination, attention to synchronicity. Laura developed techniques for working with the experiential, awareness experiments, Gestalt formation, attention to the contact boundary. Let us look more closely at their understanding of relationship, for this is where some of the deepest differences emerge. For Jung, the most important relationship in psychological development is the relationship between ego and unconscious. Yes, outer relationships matter. Jung wrote extensively about marriage as an alchemical vessel for individuation, about the importance of projections in relationship, but these outer relationships are ultimately in service of the inner work. The analytic relationship itself, in Jung's view, is a field in which unconscious material constellates and becomes available for consciousness. The transference the client's feelings toward the analyst carries projections that need to be recognized and withdrawn. The analyst, too, has feelings toward the client counter-transference, which can provide valuable information about what is activated in the client's psyche. But the goal is always to bring this material to consciousness, to integrate it, to establish the ego-self axis that allows individuation to proceed. Jung was clear that the analyst's own individuation was crucial. An analyst could only guide a client as far as the analyst had gone themselves. This is why Jungian training includes extensive personal analysis, not primarily to resolve the analyst's neuroses, but to develop the analyst's relationship with their own unconscious, so they can serve as a guide through territories they themselves have traversed. There is something solitary about this vision, something that treats the individual psyche as the primary unit of concern. Even in relationship, the focus remains on what is happening within each individual psyche, on what projections are active, on what archetypal patterns are constellated. The relationship is a crucible for individual transformation. Laura's understanding was fundamentally different. For her, the self is not primarily located inside an individual, but exists at the contact boundary, the ever-shifting frontier between organism and environment. You cannot understand a person in isolation, because personhood only exists in relationship. Even the sense of I, the experience of being a self, arises through contact and differentiation from others. This insight came partly from phenomenology, particularly Martin Buber's philosophy of dialogue, which emphasized the between the relational field that is not reducible to either of the individuals in relationship. It came also from field theory in Gestalt psychology, which showed that perception and behavior must be understood in terms of the total field, not isolated elements. In therapy, this meant that Laura did not view the client as an isolated psyche to be analyzed. The therapeutic situation was a field including both client and therapist, and what happened in that field was the therapeutic action. The therapist's presence, their authentic responsiveness, their willingness to be affected by the client, all of this was not just support for the real work of individual analysis, but was itself the work. Laura emphasized what she called the dialogic relationship, genuine meeting between two people, both of whom are fully present. The therapist is not a blank screen onto which the client projects unconscious material, as in classical psychoanalysis. The therapist is a real person responding authentically to the client, allowing themselves to be seen. This authentic meeting provides what may have been missing in the client's early life: the experience of being seen, accepted, met in one's full being. At the same time, the therapist maintains what Gestalt therapy calls creative indifference, a kind of non-attached presence that allows what is to emerge without imposing agenda or interpretation. The therapist notices what happens at the contact boundary. Does the client maintain eye contact or look away? Does their voice trail off? Do they speak about their experience or about abstractions? Does their body language match their words? These observations are not interpreted as signs of something else. They are what is happening right now in the relationship, and they are therefore the appropriate focus of attention. I notice you looked away, just as you said you were angry. What are you experiencing right now? This simple noticing can bring awareness to an automatic pattern, making it available for choice. For Laura, healing happens not through uncovering unconscious content, but through having a new kind of relational experience, one in which full contact is possible, where blocks to awareness are gently identified, where authentic expression is met with acceptance rather than judgment. The client learns, through the relationship with the therapist, that it is safe to be present, to feel fully, to express needs and wants. This is a profoundly different vision from Jung's. It locates psychological reality not in the individual psyche, but in the field between. It sees healing happening not through integrating unconscious material, but through restoring the capacity for genuine contact. It treats consciousness not as a structure within the individual, but as a process of awareness that includes the relational field. One can see these differences reflected in the physical arrangements of therapy. Jung's consulting room in Kusnacht was filled with artifacts and books, objects that pointed toward the archetypal realm. He saw clients sitting across from him, sometimes face to face, sometimes with the client in a chair and Jung at his desk. The setting supported introspection, reflection, the turning inward toward unconscious material. Laura's therapy room was simpler, less cluttered, arranged to support presence and contact. She often worked sitting, facing the client, close enough for full contact, far enough for boundary. The setting supported awareness of what was happening right now between these two people. Some Gestalt therapists use the empty chair technique, having clients speak to an absent person or a part of themselves imagined in an empty chair, a technique that made internal dialogue visible and embodied it in space. These practical differences emerged from theoretical differences, but they also reinforced those differences. Jung's setting invited symbolic thinking. Laura's setting invited present awareness. The container shapes the process, yet we must be careful not to caricature either approach. Jung was deeply interested in relationship. His work on marriage, on transference and countertransference, shows sophisticated understanding of relational dynamics. And Laura was certainly interested in individual development. Gestalt therapy's goal of authentic selfhood is a kind of individuation, even if it's not framed in archetypal terms. Perhaps the real difference is one of emphasis and starting point. Jung starts with the individual psyche and moves outward to relationship. Laura starts with the relational field and finds the individual emerging within it. Jung privileges depth over surface. Laura privileges surface as the only place where depth can manifest. Jung sees symbols as the primary language of psychological truth. Laura sees direct experience as prior to any symbolic representation. As you continue to drift between waking and sleeping, you might notice how your own experience contains both dimensions. There are moments when you are caught up in inner imagery, when dreams or fantasies or memories absorb your attention, when you are, in a sense, in relationship with inner figures and forces. At such moments, Jung's language describes your experience well. But there are also moments when you are simply present, feeling the rise and fall of your breath, aware of your body's contact with the surface beneath you, open to whatever arises without needing to interpret it. At such moments, Laura's language speaks more directly to what you experience. The body itself represents one of the sharpest divergences between Jung and Laura Perls, and exploring this difference will take us deep into their contrasting assumptions. For Jung, the body was important but ultimately secondary to the psyche. He was trained as a medical doctor and psychiatrist, so he understood bodily processes, but his focus was on the psyche's autonomous life, its symbolic productions, its archetypal patterns. Jung did write about the body, particularly in his work on Kundalini Yoga, where he attempted to understand the chakra system as a symbolic representation of the journey of consciousness. The movement of Kundalini energy up through the chakras corresponded, in Jung's reading, to the evolution of consciousness from unconscious instinct to spiritual awareness. But even here, Jung was primarily interested in the symbolic meaning of these body centers, not in the actual sensations or energies one might experience in the body. In his clinical work, Jung certainly attended to somatic symptoms. His early training was in physical medicine as much as psychiatry. He understood that psychological complexes could manifest as physical symptoms, what was called hysteria in his era. But the treatment involved making the unconscious content conscious, understanding what the symptoms symbolized or expressed. Once the psychological conflict was resolved, the physical symptom would presumably disappear. There's a moment in Jung's autobiography where he describes a critical insight that came during his period of confrontation with the unconscious. He had been feeling pulled down, drawn into dark fantasies and disturbing images. He realized he was in danger of losing his footing, of identifying with the unconscious material. So he established a practice. He would engage with the unconscious through active imagination, but then he would deliberately return to ordinary life, see patients, spend time with his family, work in his garden, play with his children. The physical, everyday world was a ballast, a way of maintaining ego stability while exploring the depths. This is telling. The body, the physical world, ordinary activities, these were important for Jung, but as anchors, as counterweights to the deeper work of engaging the unconscious. They were not themselves the locus of psychological transformation. The real action happened in the imaginal realm, in the encounter with archetypes and symbols. For Laura Perls, this would be precisely backward. The body is not a counterweight to psychological work. It is where psychological work happens. The body is not merely a vehicle for the psyche, but is itself the psyche's expression. There is no mind-body split in Gestalt therapy, no psyche somehow separate from its physical instantiation. You are an organism, and your psychological life is the way that organism organizes its experience and behavior. This conviction came from multiple sources. From Gindler, Laura learned that awareness practices focused on breath and movement could produce profound psychological changes. A person who had been anxious and scattered could, through learning to breathe more fully and move more consciously, become calmer and more integrated. This wasn't because breathing exercises relaxed the body and therefore calmed the mind. It was because the split between body and mind was artificial. The way you breathe is your anxiety or your calm. They are not separate. From Wilhelm Reich, via Fritz, Laura encountered the idea of character armor, that defensive psychological patterns are literally embodied in chronic muscular tensions. Someone who habitually suppresses anger may develop chronically tight jaw and shoulders. Someone who protects against vulnerability may constrict their breathing and harden their belly. These aren't symbolic expressions of psychological patterns. They are the patterns, manifesting in the flesh. From phenomenology, Laura absorbed the concept of the lived body, the body as we experience it from inside, as the medium of all experience. Before we reflect on experience, before we form concepts or theories, we are already embodied, already situated in a world we engage through action and perception. This lived body is not an object, not something we have, but something we are. All of this meant that Laura's therapeutic approach inevitably involved attention to the body. How are you sitting right now? How are you breathing? What happens in your body when you talk about your mother? These questions were not tangential to psychological exploration. They were its very substance. A client might say, "I'm not angry," but their jaw is clenched, their fists tight, their breathing shallow. In classical psychoanalysis, the analyst might interpret this as resistance, as the ego defending against an unconscious anger. In Gestalt therapy, Laura would simply bring awareness to what is observable. I notice your jaw is very tight, as you say you're not angry. Can you feel that? Often, simply bringing awareness to the bodily experience allows the denied feeling to surface. The client feels their clenched jaw, stays with that sensation, and anger becomes available to consciousness not through interpretation but through direct somatic awareness. Laura developed and taught many awareness experiments involving the body. One simple but powerful practice, attending to the rhythm and depth of breathing, noticing where breath is full and where it's restricted, exploring what happens if you allow breath to go into areas usually held tight. Another, exaggerating a gesture or posture to make it conscious. If your shoulders are raised, raise them more. Notice what that feels like. What impulse or feeling lives in that posture. These techniques rest on the assumption that the body is already expressing truth, already showing what is happening psychologically. You don't need to interpret or analyze. You need to bring awareness to what is already occurring. The body doesn't lie. It may be blocked, constricted, armored, but these very blocks and constrictions reveal the psychological patterns at work. Jung would not have denied the importance of the body, but he would have insisted on another dimension, the body as symbol. He was fascinated by physical symptoms that seemed to carry symbolic meaning. A woman who couldn't swallow was unable to swallow some life situation. A man with back pain was carrying a burden. Jung would work with such symptoms by amplifying their symbolic resonance, exploring what myths or images related to swallowing or carrying, seeing what archetypal pattern was activated. There's a wonderful example in Jung's work of a woman who came to him with severe headaches. Medical examination found no physical cause. In analysis, she had a dream of a figure pressing down on her head. Jung explored this image. Who or what is pressing down on you? What are you not allowing to come up? Through this symbolic work, it emerged that the woman had been suppressing her intellectual and spiritual aspirations because they conflicted with her role as a traditional wife and mother. The headache was the conflict between the life she was living and the life her psyche was demanding. As she gave expression to her suppressed potentials, the headaches diminished. This is sophisticated work, and one can't simply dismiss it as ignoring the body. Jung is attending to a bodily symptom, taking it seriously, but his method is to find the meaning of the symptom, to read it as a message from the unconscious. The symptom is treated as a symbol, something pointing beyond itself to a psychological conflict or archetypal pattern. Laura's approach would be similar in some ways, but crucially different in others. She, too, would take the headache seriously, would assume it was meaningful, but she would work with it phenomenologically, experientially, rather than symbolically. She might ask, "What do you experience in your head right now? Can you describe the quality of the pain? If the pain could speak, what would it say?" This often leads to surprising discoveries. The client might say, "It feels like pressure, like my head is in a vice." "Laura, where is the vice?" "Show me with your hands." The client makes the gesture of holding their head in their hands, and suddenly they're sobbing, realizing they've been holding themselves together, not allowing themselves to fall apart, to feel the grief or rage they've been carrying. The difference is subtle but real. Jung would move from the symptom to its symbolic amplification, connecting it to archetypal patterns. Laura would stay with the symptom as lived experience, deepening awareness of it, allowing its meaning to emerge from direct experience rather than symbolic interpretation. One could argue that these are two ways of doing essentially the same thing. Both Jung and Laura are working with the assumption that symptoms are meaningful, that the psyche is trying to express something. Both are trying to help the client access what has been unavailable to consciousness. The difference is in the route. Jung goes through symbol and myth. Laura goes through embodied awareness and present experience. But the difference in route reflects different maps of the territory. For Jung, the symptom is meaningful because it connects to the archetypal level, because the headache is not just this woman's headache, but an instance of the universal pattern of consciousness constrained by social expectations, the hero trapped by conventional life, the spiritual aspirant blocked by mundane demands. Connecting to this archetypal level gives the symptom weight, dignity, meaning. For Laura, the symptom is meaningful simply because it is part of this person's experience. It doesn't need to connect to universal patterns to matter. Its meaning is in the experiencing of it, in what it reveals about how this person is organizing their life right now. The meaning is intrinsic, not borrowed from mythology or collective symbolism. This points to something fundamental. Jung's psychology is inherently universalizing. It seeks to show how individual experience participates in collective patterns. This has an ennobling effect. Your suffering is not merely personal, but connects to the suffering of heroes and saints throughout history, but it can also diminish the particular, treating the individual as primarily an instance of a type. Laura's psychology is inherently particularizing. It seeks to honor this person's unique experience, this moment's unrepeatable quality. This respects individuality and immediate experience, but it can lose sight of larger patterns, can fragment experience into discrete moments without a unifying narrative. As you rest here, perhaps you can feel both truths. There are times when connecting your experience to larger patterns is helpful, when knowing that others have walked this path gives you courage, when myth and story illuminate your journey. And there are times when all that matters is this breath, this sensation, this moment's particular quality, when universal patterns feel like an imposition on the raw uniqueness of what you're actually experiencing. Let us turn now to dreams, that royal road to the unconscious, as Freud called them, a phrase Jung would have accepted, though he had a very different understanding than Freud of what the unconscious was and where the road led. Dreams were central to Jung's practice. He recorded his own dreams meticulously, analyzed them carefully, saw in them the guidance of the self through the individuation process. He collected his patients' dreams, noting recurring symbols and patterns, discerning the compensatory messages the unconscious was sending. Jung's method of dream work was amplification. When a patient brought a dream, Jung would have them associate to its various elements, but he would also bring his own vast knowledge of mythology, religion, alchemy, and fairy tales to bear. If a patient dreamed of a tree, Jung might explore not only what trees meant to this particular person, but also what trees have meant in human symbolic life. The world tree, Yggdrasil, in Norse mythology, the tree of life in Kabbalah, the Buddha's bow tree, the cross's tree, trees as symbols of growth, of connection between earth and heaven, of the unfolding of life. This amplification served multiple purposes. It showed the dreamer that their dream was not merely personal, that they were touching something archetypal, universal. It provided multiple angles of approach to the dream image, enriching its significance. And it activated what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create a third thing from the tension between opposites, in this case between conscious and unconscious, between personal and collective. Jung was careful to say that dream symbols could not be interpreted by a fixed dictionary. The snake doesn't always mean the same thing. One must consider the dream's context, the dreamer's situation, the sequence of dreams over time. Dreams often come in series, Jung noted, and a single dream that seems opaque may become clear when seen as part of a larger sequence. Nevertheless, Jung did believe that certain symbols had relatively consistent meanings because they reflected archetypal patterns. The descent into darkness almost always involves facing unconscious material. The appearance of a wise old man or woman usually signifies the archetype of wisdom, the self's guidance. A child often represents new possibilities, a new attitude trying to be born. These patterns repeated because they reflected the deep structure of the psyche itself. Jung also attended to the dramatic structure of dreams, which often followed a pattern: exposition setting the scene, development, complication of the situation, culmination crisis or turning point, and lysis outcome or solution, though this was sometimes missing. This structure, he believed, showed that dreams were not random but had an intent, were trying to accomplish something, usually compensation for one-sidedness in consciousness. For Laura Perls, all of this would seem like an elaborate detour away from direct experience. When a client brought a dream to Laura, she would not amplify its symbols or explore its archetypal resonances. Instead, she would ask the client to re-enter the dream experientially, to tell it in the present tense, to embody its various elements. I am walking in a forest. I see a snake on the path. I feel frightened. The snake is looking at me. Laura, be the snake. Speak as the snake. Client as snake. I am here in the sun. I am not trying to hurt anyone. I am just being a snake. Laura, what do you experience being the snake? Client, I feel powerful, calm. I don't have to justify myself. This simple technique often produces profound shifts. The dreamer discovers that the frightening snake represents a disowned part of themselves, perhaps their own power, their own calm self-sufficiency, their instinctual nature. But this discovery doesn't come from learning about snake symbolism in mythology. It comes from the direct experience of inhabiting the snake's perspective, speaking as the snake, feeling what the snake feels. Fritz Perls used to say that every element in a dream is a projected part of the dreamer. The forest is you. The snake is you. The fear is you. By reclaiming these projections, by discovering how each element reflects some aspect of your own experience or potential, you become more whole. This is not so different from Jung's individuation, but the method is utterly different. Laura was more subtle than Fritz in her application of these techniques. She didn't insist that everything in a dream was a projection. She stayed closer to phenomenological description, exploring what the client actually experienced rather than imposing a theory. But she shared the commitment to working with the dream as present experience rather than as a text to be interpreted. For Laura, dreams were not messages from a collective unconscious, but expressions of the organism's self-regulatory process. In sleep, without the restrictions of social propriety and ego control, the organism shows itself more clearly. If you're suppressing anger, you might dream of violence or attack. If you're neglecting your needs for rest and solitude, you might dream of being chased or overwhelmed. If you're not expressing your creativity, you might dream of locked boxes or unopened gifts. These dream images don't need to be amplified or connected to mythological patterns. They are already clear if we attend to them as embodied messages. The work is to experience them fully, to discover what they reveal about how you're organizing your life, what you're not allowing, what wants expression. A client dreams of being in a house where all the rooms are locked except one. In that one room, there's barely space to move. Jung might amplify this. The house as psyche, the locked rooms as potential not yet accessed, perhaps specific archetypes not yet constellated. He might explore what myths involve locked rooms, Bluebeard's chamber, Pandora's box, the forbidden room in fairy tales. What does the locked room symbolize? What is the dreamer not yet ready to see? Laura would work differently. Be in that cramped room now. What do you experience? The client feels constricted, stifled. What do you want? The client wants to open the doors, to have space, to move freely. What stops you? Through this experiential inquiry, it emerges that the client has locked away parts of themselves. Perhaps their sexuality, their anger, their ambition to be acceptable to others, and they're now living in a very small version of who they could be. The insight is similar, but notice the difference. Jung's method deepens the dream through cultural and mythological context. Laura's method deepens the dream through direct, embodied experience. Jung adds to the dream. Laura subtracts everything except the dream as lived experience. One can see how these approaches would appeal to different people. Some find that mythological amplification opens doors, creates spaciousness around. Their experience gives permission for growth by showing that others have faced similar challenges. The feeling is, I am not alone. My struggle is part of an ancient pattern. I am the hero of my own journey. This can be profoundly empowering. Others find that such amplification is distancing, that it takes them away from the raw immediacy of their experience into abstractions and concepts. They respond better to the Gestalt approach of staying with direct experience, embodying the dream, discovering its meaning through enactment rather than interpretation. The feeling is, this is my experience. I can feel it. I don't need to understand it intellectually to learn from it. Some of Jung's most interesting work involved what he called big dreams, dreams that seemed to come from a deeper level than ordinary dream life, dreams marked by numinosity, by the feeling of significance and power. These dreams often contained clear archetypal imagery, might occur at major life transitions, and seemed to carry guidance for the individuation process. Jung took such dreams very seriously, seeing them as communications from the self. One could ask, would Laura Perls recognize big dreams, or would she treat all dreams the same? The answer is probably that she would recognize that some dreams feel more significant to the dreamer, carry more charge, but she would not attribute this to their arising from a collective unconscious. Instead, she might say that these dreams represent moments when the organism's self-regulatory wisdom is speaking particularly clearly, when the gap between how one is living and how one could live becomes starkly visible. The phenomenological method demands that we acknowledge what actually appears in experience without immediately translating it into theoretical terms. If a dream feels numinous, feels charged with significance, that experience is valid and worthy of respect. But we don't need to explain this by positing a collective unconscious. We can simply note, this dream carries unusual power for this person at this time in their life. Jung would say, this is missing the point. The numinosity of big dreams comes precisely from their archetypal quality, from their connection to the collective unconscious. To reduce them to organismic self-regulation is to lose sight of the transpersonal dimension, the vertical axis connecting human consciousness to something greater than itself. And here we arrive at the fundamental disagreement. Jung's entire system requires the transpersonal, the collective, the archetypal. Without it, the system collapses into a complex form of personal psychology. Laura's entire system requires bracketing such metaphysical claims, staying with what can be observed and experienced directly. To bring in the collective unconscious is to introduce an unprovable theoretical construct that distances us from immediate experience. Is there any way to bridge this gap? Perhaps. One might say that whether or not the collective unconscious exists, as Jung imagined it, the phenomenological fact is that human beings often experience dreams and fantasies as coming from beyond the personal, as carrying meanings they didn't consciously intend. Jung's language describes this experience. Whether his metaphysics are literally true may be less important than whether his descriptions match what people actually experience. From the other direction, one might say that even if we bracket questions about the collective unconscious, the fact remains that certain symbols and patterns do recur across cultures and individuals. We can account for this through evolutionary psychology, through common human experiences of birth, death, parenthood. Through shared neural structures, we don't need to posit a collective unconscious. But we still need ways of working with these recurring patterns, and Jung's methods of amplification may be useful regardless of the theoretical framework. But these feel like compromises that neither Jung nor Laura would entirely accept. For Jung, the ontological reality of the archetypal realm was not negotiable. For Laura, the commitment to phenomenological description and embodied experience was fundamental. Their approaches rest on genuinely different philosophical foundations. Still, in practice, perhaps these differences matter less than in theory. A skillful Jungian analyst will attend to the client's embodied presence, will notice breath and gesture, will not remain entirely in the symbolic realm. A skillful Gestalt therapist will recognize when mythological or cultural material is alive for a client, will not rigidly reject anything that smacks of interpretation. The human encounter in therapy is always richer than any theory. As you drift deeper into rest, you might let the theoretical disagreements fade, recognizing that both Jung and Laura Perls were pointing toward wholeness, toward living more fully, toward authenticity. They charted different routes to similar destinations. Perhaps the unconscious and the unaware are simply different names for what is not yet integrated, not yet lived, not yet brought into the light of consciousness or awareness. Now let us explore their understanding of psychological growth and healing. What does it mean to get better? What does transformation look like? How does change happen? These questions were central for both Jung and Laura, but their answers reveal once again their fundamental differences. For Jung, psychological growth was individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you uniquely are, fulfilling your particular potential, achieving the wholeness that is your birthright. This process involves several key movements: differentiating yourself from collective identifications, integrating the shadow, encountering and relating to the anima or animus, and ultimately establishing a conscious relationship with the self. In youth, Jung believed the task is adaptation to the outer world, developing an ego, establishing yourself in a career and relationships, finding your place in society. This requires a certain one-sidedness, a development of some potentials at the expense of others. The person becomes identified with their persona, the mask we wear in the world, the role we play. A man might identify completely with being a successful professional, a woman with being a devoted mother. But around midlife, if the earlier tasks have been accomplished, the psyche begins to demand something more. The neglected potentials begin to make themselves felt, often through symptoms, through a sense of meaninglessness, through what Jung called the midlife crisis. The successful businessman might suddenly find himself depressed, questioning whether his achievements matter. The devoted mother might experience anxiety as her children become independent. These are not neurotic symptoms to be eliminated, but invitations to the second half of life's task, individuation. Individuation requires first encountering the shadow of those aspects of ourselves we've denied or repressed because they don't fit our self-image. For the person identified with being nice, the shadow contains their aggression and selfishness. For the rational intellectual, the shadow harbors emotional and instinctual life. Jung's method was to help people recognize their shadow, often first by noticing what they project onto others. The qualities you most despise in others often belong to your own shadow. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean acting it out. It means recognizing it, owning it, finding appropriate channels for its energy. The nice person discovers that their aggression, acknowledged and channeled, becomes healthy assertiveness. The intellectual discovers that their emotions, accepted and felt, enrich their life immeasurably. Beyond the shadow lies the contrasexual other, the anima in men, the animus in women. These are the internalized images of the opposite sex, shaped by one's personal experiences of mother and father, but rooted in archetypal patterns. A man's anima is his gateway to feeling, relatedness, aesthetic sensitivity. A woman's animus is her gateway to thinking, assertion, spiritual aspiration. Jung's formulations here are clearly shaped by the gender assumptions of his time, and many contemporary Jungians have modified these concepts considerably. The danger is identifying with the anima, or animus, becoming possessed by them. A man possessed by his anima becomes moody, oversensitive, petulant. A woman possessed by her animus becomes rigidly opinionated, cutting, harsh. The task is to recognize these contrasexual figures as inner others, to dialogue with them, to integrate their gifts without being overwhelmed by them. Through all of this runs the central axis, the relationship between ego and self. The self is the archetype of wholeness, the ordering center of the total personality. It is larger than ego, encompasses ego, guides ego through the individuation process. The self may appear in dreams as a divine child, a mandala, a wise figure, a powerful animal. It represents not who you consciously think you are, but who you are meant to become, your full potential. Jung was careful to distinguish the self from the ego. Western culture, he believed, had made an error in identifying the self with ego consciousness, with the experiencing subject. This leads to inflation, to the ego thinking it is the center and master of the psyche. True maturity involves recognizing that the ego is a relative center, important but not ultimate. The real center is the self, and the ego's task is to serve the self's individuation process. This is a grand vision, almost religious in its scope and ambition. Jung himself acknowledged the similarity between individuation and what various spiritual traditions call enlightenment or salvation. But he insisted that individuation was a psychological process, observable empirically in dreams and fantasies, not requiring belief in any particular religious doctrine. Laura Perls' vision of psychological growth was very different. She did not speak of individuation or the self. She spoke of authenticity, of contact, of awareness, of organismic self-regulation. Growth meant becoming more fully who you already are, not by integrating unconscious contents, but by removing blocks to natural functioning. Gestalt therapy is grounded in the idea that organisms are self-regulating. Your body knows how to maintain homeostasis. It regulates temperature, blood sugar, hormone levels automatically. The same is true, Gestalt theory proposes, of psychological functioning. You naturally know what you need, what you want, what is good for you, if you can stay in contact with your organismic experience. But we learn to interrupt this natural self-regulation. Through socialization, through experiences of punishment or abandonment, we learn to distrust our organismic experience. We learn to override our needs to gain approval, to suppress our feelings, to avoid conflict, to deny our perceptions, to maintain relationships. We develop what Gestalt therapy calls fixed gestalts, rigid patterns of behavior and experience that persist even when they're no longer adaptive. These interruptions happen at the contact boundary, the ever-shifting frontier between self and environment. Gestalt therapy identifies several characteristic interruptions: introjection, swallowing whole, what others say rather than chewing it, testing it against your own experience; projection, attributing to others what is actually your own experience; retroflexion, doing to yourself what you want to do to others or want others to do to you; confluence, losing the boundary between self and other, merging inappropriately; and deflection, avoiding direct contact through vagueness, humor, intellectualization. For example, a client might say, "I should be more successful." Laura would identify this as an introjection. Who says you should? Who does this voice belong to? Often it's a parent's voice, a cultural expectation, internalized but never truly examined. The work is to chew this introjection, to test it against actual experience. Do I really value what this voice calls success? What do I actually want? Or a client might say, "You think I'm weak." Laura, I haven't said that. Is that perhaps what you think about yourself? The projection is identified, and the client is invited to own it. I judge myself as weak. When I feel vulnerable, I'm harsh with myself. The goal of Gestalt therapy is not to integrate unconscious contents, but to restore contact with yourself, with others, with your environment. Full contact means being present without defenses, aware of what you experience, able to respond authentically. It means the ability to form clear gestalts, to foreground what's important, to address what needs attention, to complete experiences rather than leaving them hanging. An example: someone says goodbye to you casually, and you feel hurt, but you don't acknowledge this even to yourself. You just feel vaguely uncomfortable for the rest of the day. This is an incomplete gestalt. Full contact would mean recognizing, "I'm hurt. I wanted a warmer goodbye." You might then complete the gestalt by acknowledging this to yourself, or by telling the other person, or by recognizing that you wanted more warmth than this particular relationship realistically offers. The point is awareness and completion, not continued avoidance and incompletion. Growth, in this framework, is not a grand process of individuation, but a continuous practice of awareness and authentic contact. There's no endpoint, no achievement of the self. There's simply the ongoing process of being present, staying in contact, responding authentically to what arises. One can see immediately how different this is from Jung's vision. Jung's individuation is a heroic journey, a lifelong quest with identifiable stages and archetypal encounters. It has a quasi-religious dimension, connecting the individual to transpersonal depths. Laura's growth is more modest, more everyday, simply being present, simply authentic, simply aware. It lacks the grandeur of Jung's vision, but also avoids what critics might call its grandiosity. Jung might say that Laura's vision is too horizontal, lacking the vertical dimension that connects human to divine, personal to archetypal. Without the self as transcendent reference point, how do we avoid mere adaptation, mere adjustment to social expectations? How do we access the revolutionary potential of the unconscious, its capacity to shatter our comfortable identifications and call us to something greater? Laura might respond that Jung's vision risks inflation, risks ego identifying with archetypal material, risks bypassing immediate experience in pursuit of symbolic meanings. The simple practice of awareness, of being present to what is actually happening, is in fact revolutionary. It means no longer living according to interjected shoulds, no longer projecting your disowned qualities onto others, no longer avoiding contact through fixed patterns. This is transformation, but transformation grounded in present experience rather than archetypal depths. Who is right? Perhaps the question is misguided. Different people need different things at different times. Someone who has spent years overanalyzing, living in their head, disconnected from feeling and body, may need exactly what Laura offers: permission to stop interpreting and simply be present, to discover that awareness itself, without interpretation, is transformative. Someone else who has been living a conventional life without reflection, identified with social roles, may need exactly what Jung offers: recognition that there are depths to explore, that your symptoms and dreams are invitations to a larger life, that becoming who you truly are will require confronting shadow, integrating contrasexual other, establishing relationship with the self. In practice, good therapy probably involves both. There are times to explore symbolic meanings, to amplify dream images, to connect personal experience to larger patterns. And there are times to simply breathe, to notice body sensations, to stay with present experience without interpretation. The skilled therapist, whether Jungian or Gestalt or some integration, knows when to do what, but the theoretical difference remains significant. Jung's psychology is essentially Platonic, pointing toward eternal forms beneath temporal manifestations. Laura's psychology is essentially Aristotelian or phenomenological, finding all the meaning we need in the careful observation of what actually appears. This is not a difference that can be easily reconciled. As you lie here in the deepening quiet, you might notice how your own process of growth has evolved. Both movements, times of descent into depths, of exploring symbolic meanings, of connecting to something larger than yourself, and times of simple presence, of discovering that being fully aware of this breath, this sensation, this moment is enough. Let us now turn to perhaps the most subtle and profound difference between Jung and Laura Perls: their understanding of what we might call the ontological status of psychological reality. What is real? What actually exists? This is not a question psychologists usually address explicitly, but every psychological system rests on implicit ontological assumptions. For Jung, the psyche is real as physical matter, perhaps more real. The unconscious is not merely a metaphor or a theoretical construct. It is an objective reality with its own laws, its own inhabitants, its own autonomous life. When Jung engaged in active imagination with the figure of Philemon, he experienced Philemon as having independent existence, as knowing things Jung didn't know, as capable of surprising Jung with his responses. Jung struggled throughout his life to articulate this ontological claim. He used various formulations. The archetypes are psychoid, operating at a level where psyche and matter are not yet differentiated. They are real as flowers are real, he said in one interview. Meaning they have objective existence whether or not any particular consciousness encounters them. The collective unconscious is not something I have. It is something I participate in, something that transcends individual existence. This led Jung to his controversial concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that could not be explained by causation. When you dream of a friend you haven't seen in years and they call the next day, Jung would not dismiss this as mere coincidence. He would see it as evidence that psyche and world are not separate, that meaning bridges inner and outer, that the archetypal level organizes both psychological and physical reality. Critics accused Jung of mysticism, of abandoning science for occultism. Jung insisted he was simply being empirical, observing what actually happens rather than fitting observations into a predetermined materialist framework. The psyche does produce these experiences of meaningful connection between inner and outer. Any psychology that ignores them for the sake of theoretical purity is impoverished. For Laura Perls, all of this would be precisely the kind of metaphysical speculation that phenomenology bracketed. We don't need to make claims about the ontological status of psyche, about whether archetypes exist independently, about whether synchronicities reveal some acausal connecting principle. We need to describe experience as it actually appears, without importing theoretical constructs. The phenomenological method begins with epoché, the suspension of metaphysical assumptions. We set aside questions of what really exists and attend instead to phenomena, to what appears in experience. A dream appears. We can describe its qualities, its felt significance, its relationship to other experiences. We don't need to say whether it comes from a personal or collective unconscious, whether its symbols are arbitrary or archetypal. This philosophical stance underlies everything in Gestalt therapy. When Laura speaks of awareness, she means phenomenological awareness, direct attention to what appears in experience, without interpretation, without theoretical overlay. When she speaks of organismic self-regulation, she's not making metaphysical claims about some vital force. She's describing an observable pattern. Organisms, when not blocked, tend toward health. The difference might seem abstract, but it has practical implications. A Jungian analyst will often say things like, "Your dream of the snake suggests the archetype of transformation is activated. The self is calling you to shed your old skin, to undergo metamorphosis." This language implies that something real, the archetype of transformation, the self, is acting, has intent, makes demands. A Gestalt therapist will say things like, "You're describing a powerful dream. What do you experience as you tell it? What do you notice in your body? If you could speak as the snake, what would you say?" This language stays with what is observable in present experience, doesn't import metaphysical entities. For some clients, the Jungian language is empowering. It gives meaning and significance to their experience, connects them to something larger, provides guidance and direction. The feeling is, I am not alone. The self knows where I need to go. I can trust the process. For other clients, the Jungian language feels like imposing meaning from outside. They respond better to the Gestalt invitation to discover meaning through their own experience. The feeling is, I don't need anyone to tell me what my dream means. I can discover its significance by staying with my direct experience of it. But notice what's at stake here. If Jung is right, if archetypes really do exist as autonomous entities with their own agendas, then ignoring them or reducing them to personal experience is a kind of blindness. It's like insisting that because we can only know the sun through our experience of sunlight, we don't need to posit the actual sun. Jung would say, no, the archetypes are real. They operate whether or not you acknowledge them. And psychological health requires conscious relationship with them. If Laura is right, if the phenomenological method of bracketing metaphysical claims is the appropriate stance, then Jung's ontological claims are at best unprovable and at worst actively misleading. They create a pseudo-reality, an imaginal world that may be psychologically meaningful but shouldn't be mistaken for objective existence. This doesn't mean dismissing Jung's work, but it means understanding his archetypal language as poetry, as a way of speaking about psychological experience, not as literal description of metaphysical reality. This disagreement extends to their view of therapy itself. For Jung, therapy is ultimately a relationship between four: the patient's ego, the patient's unconscious, the analyst's ego, and the analyst's unconscious. The analyst must have done their own work, have established relationship with their own unconscious, so they can recognize when archetypal material is constellated, when transference and countertransference carry important messages, when the self is trying to guide the process. The analyst's unconscious responds to the patient's unconscious, often before the analyst consciously knows what's happening. Jung trusted this, saw the therapeutic relationship as occurring partly at an unconscious level. He spoke of the analytic third, something created between analyst and patient that belongs fully to neither, a new psychological reality born from their encounter. For Laura, therapy is a relationship between two people, meeting in the present moment, creating a field of awareness together. The therapist must be fully present, aware of their own experience, authentic in their responses. But there's no need to posit an unconscious level of communication. What matters is what actually happens in the encounter, how the client makes or avoids contact, how the therapist responds, what emerges in the space between them. Laura emphasized the dialogic relationship, a concept she drew from Martin Buber. Buber distinguished between I-it and I-thou relationships. In I-it, the other is an object to be observed, understood, manipulated. In I-thou, the other is encountered as subject, as a full presence, met in the between space that is neither mine nor yours but ours. Therapy, for Laura, required moments of I-thou encounter, genuine meeting between therapist and client. This couldn't be sustained constantly. Much of therapy involved it observation and intervention, but the possibility of I-thou meeting needed to be present. This meant the therapist couldn't hide behind professional neutrality or analytic interpretation. They had to be real, available, willing to be affected by the client. Jung would not have disagreed with this exactly, but his emphasis was different. The analyst must maintain boundaries, must not gratify the patient's needs for the analyst to be friend or parent or lover. The analyst must frustrate these transference demands so that the patient is forced back to their own unconscious, to finding in themselves what they seek from the analyst. The analyst serves as a catalyst for the patient's individuation, but must not become the object of individuation. These are subtle differences in emphasis, but they matter. Jungian therapy tends toward longer duration, deeper transference, more extensive exploration of unconscious material. Gestalt therapy tends toward more active intervention, more present-centered work, more emphasis on the client's immediate capacity for change. Is either approach superior? The research literature doesn't give a clear answer, partly because different approaches work better for different people and different issues. What seems clear is that both approaches, practiced skillfully, can be profoundly helpful. This suggests that they're working with different aspects of human psychology, or approaching similar territory through different routes. Perhaps the deepest convergence between Jung and Laura Perls lies in their shared conviction that human beings are oriented toward wholeness. For Jung, this orientation is the work of the self, the archetype that guides individuation. For Laura, it is organismic self-regulation, the natural tendency toward health and integration. Different languages for perhaps the same reality. Something in us knows the way, if we can learn to follow it. Both Jung and Laura emphasize the importance of not forcing, not imposing predetermined solutions. Jung cautioned against the analyst's identification with the healer archetype, the temptation to save the patient. He insisted that the analyst must not know better than the patient's own psyche what is needed. The unconscious knows. The task is to listen. Laura emphasized that the therapist must not impose interpretations or solutions. The client's organismic wisdom is trustworthy. The task is to clear away blocks to that wisdom's expression. Both, in their different ways, were practicing a kind of Taoist non-forcing, trusting a process larger than ego consciousness. Both also recognized that this journey is endless. Jung knew that individuation was lifelong, that no one ever finished analysis. New material continually emerged from the unconscious. New phases of life brought new challenges. Laura knew that awareness is a practice, not an achievement. You never arrive at perfect presence. You simply return again and again to this moment, this breath, this contact. As you sink deeper into rest, perhaps these distinctions begin to blur. The imaginal and the immediate, the symbolic and the literal, the archetypal and the embodied, perhaps they are not finally separate but different faces of a single mystery. Your body is breathing, following rhythms older than consciousness. Your mind drifts through images and memories, perhaps touching patterns as old as humanity itself. Where does one end and the other begin? Now, as we move into the final movements of this exploration, let us reflect more freely on what this dialogue between Jung and Laura Perls reveals about the human condition, about the nature of consciousness, about the eternal questions that psychology, at its best, continues to illuminate. Both Jung and Laura Perls lived through the catastrophes of the 20th century 2 world wars, the Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the Cold War. They witnessed the collapse of certainties, the revelation of human capacity for both horror and healing. Their psychologies were forged in this crucible, attempts to understand what had happened and to offer paths toward greater humanity. Jung's response to the collective nightmare of the 20th century was to seek patterns that transcended the historical moment. He studied alchemy, mythology, religion, looking for evidence of humanity's perennial struggle with the forces of darkness and light. He believed that the horrors of Nazism and war arose partly from unconscious archetypal forces, the activation of Wotan, the old Germanic god of destructive frenzy, or the shadow of rationalist civilization, all that had been denied or suppressed, erupting with terrible violence. For Jung, healing the collective required healing the individual. If enough individuals undertook the work of individuation, becoming conscious of their own shadows and dark potentials, perhaps collective possession by archetypal forces could be prevented. This was both modest and grandiose. Modest in focusing on individual psychological work rather than political revolution. Grandiose in imagining that individual analysis could address collective evil. Laura's response was different. She and Fritz and their circle were part of the Jewish intellectual diaspora, scattered by Nazi terror, forced to rebuild their lives in foreign lands. Her emphasis on present-centered awareness, on embodied experience, on the capacity to make contact, perhaps, this reflects the refugee experience, the discovery that when everything familiar is stripped away, you must find ground in immediate experience, in breath and body, in authentic encounter. Gestalt therapy's emphasis on personal responsibility, not in the sense of blame, but in the sense of responsibility. The capacity to respond also seems shaped by the question, how did ordinary people participate in or enable atrocity? The answer Gestalt therapy suggests is by not being present, by following introjected commands without testing them against direct experience, by losing contact with their own felt sense of right and wrong, by merging confluently with collective movements rather than maintaining individual awareness. If people could learn to stay present, to trust their organismic wisdom, to maintain contact with their own experience rather than blindly following authority or social pressure, perhaps such horrors could be prevented or at least resisted. This too is both modest and ambitious. Modest in its focus on simple presence and awareness, ambitious in imagining that such practices could shift collective behavior. Both Jung and Laura were, in their different ways, responding to the modern crisis of meaning. The old certainties, religious, cultural, social, had crumbled. In such a situation, where does one find orientation? Jung's answer, in the eternal patterns of the psyche, in the archetypes that have guided humanity for millennia, in the self's wisdom that transcends cultural conditioning. Laura's answer, in direct experience, in the body's truth, in the immediate contact with what is actually present, rather than inherited ideas about what should be. These are not incompatible answers, but they emphasize different resources. Jung asks us to go deep, to find in the unconscious depths a wisdom older and larger than ego. Laura asks us to come fully into the present, to find in immediate experience a ground that doesn't require metaphysical belief or cultural tradition. One thinks of T.S. Eliot's lines, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Jung's journey goes down and in, descending through layers of personal and collective unconscious, only to discover at the depths the self, which encompasses and transcends ego. Laura's journey goes into presence, removing the veils of interpretation and concept, only to discover immediate experience, which was always already here. Both journeys end in a kind of simplicity, not the naive simplicity of those who have never questioned, but the earned simplicity of those who have fully explored. Jung's individuation leads, if pursued fully, to what the mystics call gnosis, a direct knowing that transcends conceptual thought. Laura's awareness practice leads to what the Buddhists call mindfulness, a direct presence that needs no elaboration. These convergences suggest that different paths may lead to similar destinations, that the human psyche, approached with sincerity and rigor from different angles, reveals consistent truths, whether we speak of integrating the shadow or removing blocks to awareness, whether we frame transformation as archetypal or organismic. We are addressing the same fundamental human tendency toward self-deception, toward living from false centers, toward pursuing what we think we should want rather than what we actually need. And both Jung and Laura recognize that this work is fundamentally about relationship, not just relationship to others, but relationship to aspects of ourselves, relationship to the natural world, relationship to the mystery of existence itself. Jung spoke of establishing right relationship between ego and unconscious, between consciousness and the archetypal depths. Laura spoke of restoring good contact, removing interruptions that prevent genuine encounter. Different languages for the same essential movement, from alienation to connection, from fragmentation to wholeness. This raises the question, can contemporary psychology integrate their insights? Has it done so? The answer is complex. Jungian psychology continues as a vibrant tradition, with training institutes around the world, ongoing scholarly work, and clinical practice. It has adapted and evolved. Contemporary Jungians are more relationally oriented than Jung himself, more sensitive to gender and cultural issues, more integrated with neuroscience and developmental research. Gestalt therapy also continues, though less prominently than in its heyday in the 1960s and 70s. Its techniques have been widely borrowed by other approaches. The empty chair technique, the focus on body awareness, the emphasis on present-centeredness. Many contemporary therapists use Gestalt methods without necessarily identifying as Gestalt therapists, but the fundamental metaphysical divide remains. Most contemporary psychology is implicitly or explicitly phenomenological, bracketing questions about the ontological status of psychological entities. The collective unconscious archetypes, the self, these remain controversial concepts, often dismissed as unprovable or metaphorical. The emphasis in contemporary therapy is pragmatic. What works? What helps people change? These questions tend to favor approaches that can be operationalized and measured, which advantages phenomenological methods over depth interpretations. Yet something is lost in this pragmatic turn. Jung's insistence that the psyche has depth, that there are levels of meaning beyond the immediately apparent, that our lives participate in larger patterns. This vision continues to speak to many who find contemporary psychology too shallow, too focused on symptom reduction and adjustment. The mythological, the symbolic, the archetypal, these dimensions of experience don't fit easily into evidence-based treatment protocols, but they remain profoundly meaningful to many people. Similarly, while Gestalt techniques are widely used, Laura Perls' deeper philosophical commitments, the phenomenological method, the field theory perspective, the emphasis on dialogue and presence are less widely understood or practiced. Many therapists use Gestalt experiments as techniques without inhabiting the worldview that gives those techniques their deepest meaning. Perhaps what contemporary psychology most needs is not to choose between Jung and Laura Perls, but to recognize their complementarity. Human beings live on multiple levels simultaneously. We are embodied organisms, living in the present moment, requiring breath and food and contact. We are also meaning-making creatures, living in stories and symbols, haunted by dreams and driven by visions we don't fully understand. A fully adequate psychology would honor both dimensions. It would recognize that sometimes the path to healing leads through symbolic interpretation, through understanding how personal experience resonates with mythological patterns, through dialogue with unconscious figures. At other times, the path leads through embodied awareness, through staying with present experience, through removing blocks to natural self-regulation. The skilled therapist would be able to move between these modes as the client's needs dictate. With one client or at one stage of work, amplifying dream symbols and exploring archetypal patterns might be exactly what's needed. With another client or at another stage, focusing on breath and body, staying rigorously in the present, might be the more healing approach. This is not eclecticism in the sense of randomly mixing techniques. It's recognizing that human psychological life has multiple dimensions that require different approaches to be fully addressed. We are not only bodies and we are not only imaginations. We are embodied consciousness, organisms who dream, animals who create meaning, biological entities who encounter the numinous. As you rest here, you might notice this multiplicity in your own experience. Your body lies here, breathing, heavy with approaching sleep. This is the territory Laura mapped the simple fact of embodied presence. But your mind also wanders, producing images and half-thoughts, perhaps drifting toward dream. This is the territory Jung explored, the autonomous activity of the psyche, creating meanings beyond conscious control. Are these two territories or one? The question may be unanswerable, or rather, it may be that the answer depends on the perspective you take. From one angle, they appear separate, body and psyche, immediate and symbolic, awareness and imagination. From another angle, they are inseparable aspects of a single reality, the living human being, experiencing. Perhaps Jung and Laura Perls can be seen as emphasizing different necessary poles of a dialectic. Jung emphasizes the pole of meaning, symbolization, the imaginal realm. Laura emphasizes the pole of being, presence, immediate experience. Human life requires both. We need to make meaning of our experience, to find patterns in narrative, to connect personal to collective. We also need to simply be present, to inhabit our bodies, to meet life directly rather than through interpretive filters. The danger of Jung's approach is inflation and endless interpretation, ego identifying with archetypal material, or analysis becoming interminable exploration of symbols without grounding in practical life change. The danger of Laura's approach is superficiality and presentism staying so close to immediate experience that larger patterns are missed, or focusing so much on present-centered technique that depth work never happens. But these are dangers, not inherent flaws. Practiced with skill and wisdom, Jung's depth psychology opens doors to profound transformation through engaging the imaginal realm. Practiced with skill and wisdom, Laura's phenomenological approach grounds transformation in embodied awareness and authentic contact. One thinks of the ancient Greek distinction between Apollo and Dionysus. Apollo represents order, form, clarity, differentiation, the beautiful forms that make chaos bearable. Dionysus represents ecstasy, dissolution, the overwhelming power of nature and instinct. Greek tragedy, at its best, honored both, showing that human excellence requires acknowledging both Apollonian form and Dionysian intensity. Jung and Laura Perls might be seen as representing a similar polarity. Jung is more Apollonian, seeking patterns, finding form in chaos, differentiating the archetypes, bringing the clarity of symbolic understanding. Laura is more Dionysian, emphasizing direct experience, the body's truth, the overwhelming immediacy of here and now, the dissolution of conceptual categories in favor of pure presence. But this parallel is imperfect. Jung also explored the Dionysian through his descent into the unconscious, his engagement with the overwhelming power of archetypal forces, and Laura also sought clarity and form through phenomenological description, through careful articulation of the structure of experience. Perhaps better, Jung emphasizes vertical transcendence, the axis connecting human to divine, personal to archetypal, temporal to eternal. Laura emphasizes horizontal immanence, the axis connecting organism to environment, self to other, this moment to this moment. Wholeness requires both axes, the vertical that gives life, depth and meaning, the horizontal that keeps us grounded and connected. As you drift in that space between waking and sleeping, you might notice how both axes are present in your experience. Horizontally, you are here, breathing, body heavy, in contact with whatever surface holds you. This is enough. This is complete in itself. But vertically, you may notice images arising, memories drifting past, perhaps the first wisps of dream beginning. These have their own reality, their own meanings, their own claim on your attention. The deepest wisdom may be learning to honor both, to be fully present to immediate experience while also remaining open to the symbolic and imaginal, to inhabit the body fully while also allowing the psyche its autonomous life, to stay grounded in the here and now while also recognizing participation in patterns larger than the personal. Jung and Laura Perls approached not as opponents, but as complementary voices, offer this integrated vision. From Jung, we learn to respect the psyche's depths, to take dreams seriously, to recognize our participation in transpersonal patterns. From Laura, we learn to trust immediate experience, to find ground in the body, to value authentic presence over abstract interpretation. Both teach us that healing is not primarily about fixing what's broken, but about removing obstacles to natural wholeness. For Jung, the obstacles are one-sidedness, unconsciousness, failure to recognize and integrate shadow and contrasexual other. For Laura, the obstacles are blocks to awareness, interruptions of contact, fixed patterns that prevent fresh response. Different descriptions of similar realities. We are estranged from ourselves, divided, not fully present. The healing journey is returning, integrating, arriving home. Both also teach us that this journey cannot be taken alone. Jung emphasized the necessity of the analytic relationship, the presence of another who has done their own work and can companion the descent. Laura emphasized the dialogic encounter, the genuine meeting that provides what early life may have withheld. Different emphases, but both recognize that transformation happens in relationship, that we need others to mirror aspects of ourselves we cannot see directly. This is perhaps the ultimate convergence. Both Jung and Laura Perls understood that we are profoundly relational beings. Jung's psychology of individuation might seem solitary, the individual encountering their own unconscious, integrating their own shadow. But Jung insisted this couldn't happen without relationship, without the container of analysis, without the friction and grace of genuine human encounter. Laura's psychology is explicitly relational from the start. The self exists at the contact boundary, not as an isolated entity. But this recognition of relationality leads not to loss of self, but to its discovery. In genuine contact, in authentic meeting, you discover who you are precisely through encountering the other. Both are responses to the fundamental human predicament. We are born into separation, individuality, the painful awareness of being distinct selves, cut off from the original unity of infant mother, organism, environment, self-world. This separation is necessary for consciousness, for growth, for becoming fully human. But it brings existential loneliness, the sense that we are fundamentally alone in our experience. The healing journey is finding connection without losing individuality, finding wholeness without regressing to unconscious unity. Jung's individuation is this journey traced through encounters with unconscious figures, through the gradual integration of all that was projected or denied. Laura's restoration of good contact is this journey traced through recovering the capacity for authentic presence and genuine meeting. Perhaps in the end, Jung and Laura Perls are speaking different dialects of the same language, the language of psychological healing, of becoming fully human, of the journey from fragmentation to wholeness. Their dialects differ enough that translation is sometimes difficult, and followers of each tradition may struggle to understand the other. But beneath the differences of vocabulary and emphasis, they share core commitments to taking human experience seriously, to trusting processes larger than ego consciousness, to believing that healing and wholeness are possible. As you sink into the threshold of sleep, carry with you this vision of complementarity. You need not choose between the symbolic and the literal, the archetypal and the immediate, the imaginal and the embodied. You are large enough to contain all of these dimensions, complex enough to require multiple maps for different territories. Jung and Laura Perls each offer you a map. Learn to read them both, and the landscape of your own psyche will be richer, more fully explored, more deeply inhabited. Let your breathing slow, your body settle. Let the images that arise carry whatever meanings they offer, whether archetypal or personal, and let your simple presence here, breathing, being, suffice. Both the journey into depths and the return to surface, both the exploration of symbol and the rest in immediate experience, these are movements of a single dance, a single process of becoming whole. In the darkness, behind your closed eyes, vast spaces open Jung's collective unconscious, perhaps that realm of eternal patterns and potentials, or perhaps simply the darkness of your own embodied presence, Laura's territory of immediate being. Does it matter which? Both descriptions point to the same mystery, that you are more than you know, larger than you think, connected to something that transcends your conscious ego. Trust that larger something, whether you call it the self or organismic wisdom or simply the healing capacity of nature. Trust also your capacity to become conscious, to integrate, to grow. This trust is what Jung and Laura Perls both offer different paths to the same fundamental faith that human beings are not broken mechanisms requiring external repair, but living systems capable of self-healing when conditions are right. The conditions that are right, for Jung, engagement with the unconscious through dreams, active imagination, analysis. For Laura, restoration of awareness, removal of blocks, authentic contact. Different conditions, but both create space for that which knows the way to guide the journey. As you release into sleep, you enact a daily individuation, a nightly return to the source. In sleep, ego consciousness relinquishes control, and the autonomous psyche takes over, creating dreams from its inexhaustible creativity. Jung would see this as the self's nightly communication, offering images that compensate for the day's one-sidedness. Laura might see it as the organism's self-regulating process, working through unfinished business, integrating the day's experiences. Both descriptions honor the same mystery, that something continues when consciousness ceases, that the psyche doesn't stop when ego sleeps, that healing happens in the dark. Sleep is trust, letting go of control, surrendering to a process larger than will, allowing what needs to happen to unfold. This trust is what both Jung and Laura Perls invite. Trust the process. Trust that your dreams mean something, that your body knows something, that your psyche is oriented toward wholeness. Trust that obstacles to growth can be identified and addressed. Trust that you are not alone, whether accompanied by archetypal guides or by the therapist's authentic presence. You need not make the journey in isolation. And trust that the journey has no final destination, that wholeness is not a state achieved once and for all, but an ongoing dynamic balance, constantly lost and regained. Jung's individuation continues throughout life. Laura's awareness practice is never finished. Both understood that human being is a verb, not a noun, a process, not a thing, a constant becoming rather than a fixed state. Let this be your comfort as you drift toward sleep. You need not achieve anything, fix anything, complete anything. The work is simply to stay engaged with the process, aware enough to notice where you're stuck, courageous enough to explore what you've avoided, patient enough to allow natural healing to unfold. Jung would remind you that this process has been undertaken by countless humans before you, that you walk a path worn by heroes and seekers throughout history. Your struggles are not merely personal, but participate in the eternal human journey. Let this connection sustain you. Laura would remind you that all you ever need is right here, in this breath, in this moment's sensation and feeling. You need not accomplish some distant transformation. Simply being present, aware, authentic, this is enough. This is everything. Both truths live in you. You are part of eternal patterns, and you are this unique, unrepeatable moment. You are depth, and you are surface. You are symbol, and you are breath. You are becoming, and you are being. You are the journey, and you are always already home. Rest in this paradox, this mystery. Let Jung's archetypal imagination and Laura's phenomenological presence both find home in you. Let the conversation between them continue, not as abstract theory, but as lived experience, the daily practice of going deeper while staying present, of honoring both the extraordinary and the ordinary, of listening to dreams' wisdom while trusting body's truth. The night gathers you in its arms. The darkness is not empty but full of potential, of rest, of the healing that happens when striving ceases. Whether you meet archetypal figures in tonight's dreams or simply rest in dreamless sleep, you are held by something larger than yourself. Whether you call that something the self or nature or simply the mystery of being, let it cradle you. Jung and Laura Perls both pointed toward this letting go, this trust in what is larger than ego. Their languages differ, their maps show different features of the terrain, but both lead to the same threshold, the place where you stop trying to manage and control, where you surrender to the wisdom that moves in you without your conscious direction. Cross that threshold now. Let Jung and Laura both fade, their dialogue becoming distant music that lulls rather than engages. You have received their gifts, Jung's reminder of depth and meaning, Laura's invitation to presence and authenticity. Let these gifts settle into you without effort, without grasping. What remains when even these teachers recede? Simply this: breathing, being, the gentle passage from waking to sleeping, from consciousness to dreams, from day to night. Simply this: Your irreplaceable presence here, now, part of the great conversation between all beings, all times, all ways of understanding what it means to be human. Sleep now, wanderer. The exploration continues in realms beyond waking thought. Whether you descend into archetypal depths or rest in the simple darkness of embodied presence, you are exactly where you need to be. The psyche knows its way. The organism knows its wisdom. You can rest. Jung's tower at Bollingen and Laura's therapy room in New York exist now only in memory and influence, but what they discovered remains available, encoded in their words, their methods, their fundamental insights. You carry both within you, the capacity for symbolic depth and the capacity for immediate presence, the ability to dream and the ability to awaken, the journey inward and the journey toward authentic contact. These are not burdens but gifts, not demands but possibilities. When you need depth, Jung's maps are there. When you need grounding, Laura's practices await. Between them, they chart the full territory of human psychological life, the heights and depths, the inner and outer, the eternal and the immediate. Rest in this completeness. You lack nothing essential. The capacity for wholeness lives in you, whether through Jung's path of integrating the unconscious or Laura's way of removing blocks to awareness. Both paths lead home, lead to the same discovery. You are already whole beneath the fragmentation, already wise beneath the confusion, already connected beneath the loneliness. Let this knowing settle into your bones, your breath, your drifting consciousness. Let Jung and Laura Perls' dialogue become a lullaby, their voices blending into the general music of healing traditions across time and culture. Let their specific insights dissolve into the general truth that human beings can grow, can heal, can become more fully themselves. This is enough to know. This is everything you need as you cross into sleep. The questions they raised continue. The explorations they began go on, but for now, release them. Let your own psyche do its nightly work without interference from theories or teachings. Let your own organism regulate itself toward rest and restoration. Trust what Jung and Laura Perls both trusted, that something in you knows the way, whether you call it self or organismic wisdom or simply life. That something continues its work while you sleep, weaving together the day's fragments, processing what was lived, preparing you for what comes next. You are held, you are guided. You are whole even in your brokenness, complete even in your incompleteness, perfect even in your imperfection. This is what both depth psychology and phenomenology ultimately reveal, that the human being, fully seen, fully acknowledged, is a miracle of complexity and potential, carrying both ancient wisdom and present possibility. Sleep in this knowing. Dream if dreams come, bearing whatever messages they may, or rest in dreamless dark, the simple restoration of an organism returning to its ground. Either way, you participate in the mystery. You embody the paradox. You are the living conversation between depth and surface, symbol and sensation, soul and body. The night is deep and gentle. The silence is full of presence. You are where you belong, doing exactly what you need to do, which is simply this: breathing, being, releasing into sleep. Let Jung and Laura Perls bless this passage, their different gifts combining into a single benediction. Go deep and stay present. Honor symbol and trust sensation. Become who you are. Rest Now, dear wanderer. The exploration of consciousness continues in the only place it can truly happen, in your own lived experience, your own breathing body, your own dreaming mind. Jung and Laura Perls have lit lamps along the path, but the path is yours to walk, and for now, the walking is done. Now is the time for stillness, for surrender, for sleep. Welcome the darkness. Welcome the unknown. Welcome whatever arises in the night, whether image or emptiness, dream or void. All of it is you. All of it is home. All of it is the territory that Jung and Laura Perls mapped with such care and devotion. Their maps are gifts, but the territory is yours to inhabit. And so we close this night's exploration, this long conversation between two great minds who saw the human psyche from different angles, but with equal reverence. May their insights serve you well. May their dialogue continue in you, not as conflict, but as creative tension, not as confusion, but as richness. May you find in their complementary visions a path toward your own wholeness, however you understand that mystery. Sleep deeply, dream richly, wake refreshed. The conversation continues, always. But for now, let silence and darkness have their way. Let the unconscious and the unaware weave their wisdom while consciousness rests. You are safe, you are held, you are home. Good night, wanderer. Until we meet again in future explorations of the great dialogues that shape our understanding of the human soul, rest well. Jung and Laura Perls have shared their gifts. Now comes your task, to live them, to embody them, to make them real in your own unique journey toward wholeness. The story is told for now, the exploration complete. Only sleep remains, and dreams, and the quiet healing that happens when we finally stop trying and simply allow ourselves to be. May you find in that allowing everything Jung and Laura Perls promised, depth and presence, symbol and sensation, the integration of all that you are into the wholeness that was always already there, waiting only to be recognized and embodied. Sleep well, wanderer, sleep deep. The night is yours and all its mysteries, and when you wake, may you bring with you something of what Jung and Laura Perls both knew, that human consciousness is a gift beyond measure, that psychological healing is possible, that the journey toward wholeness is the most worthy adventure, whether traced through archetypal depths or grounded in embodied presence. Rest now. The words are ended. Only silence remains, and breath and being. This is enough. This is everything. This is the teaching beneath all teachings. Simply to be here, breathing, present, whole in your incompleteness, complete in your becoming, perfect exactly as you are. Good night.